the public is worried about climate change and wants to know what to do. And that's not falling off the list of priorities, that's staying high across the world. And so what we really need to do is sort of latch onto that and find innovations in democracy. How do you engage the public in a more thoughtful conversation than soundbite clickbait allows?
Welcome to Talking About Thinking the Unthinkable, our latest leadership conversation and podcast. Hello, I'm Nick Gowing, founder and director of the Thinking the Unthinkable project since 2014. Science is making it clear that the need to confront and embrace the climate and nature emergencies is ever greater and more urgent. But communicating this is a huge challenge. As many say, the narrative needs to be much sharper and clearer to convince a huge number of waverers. Or despite what people see and experience around them, the decimation of nature, the floods, the greater extremes of temperature, and the ever-growing basic threats to human survival, it remains an uphill struggle to convince vast numbers of people, especially political and corporate leaders, of the existential seriousness of what is now facing us all, and therefore what dramatic leadership they must now show. The reality is that stark. So I'm delighted to be joined by Rachel Kyte, a globally acclaimed expert on energy and finance. Rachel has been a special representative to the UN Secretary General, Chief Executive of Sustainable Energy for All, a Vice President of both the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation. She's now Professor of Practice in Climate Policy at Oxford University's Blavatnik School. The focus is on communicating how governments and the public must organize themselves to confront the huge systems change that is needed and how to generate political and public support. Rachel, a warm welcome. Enormous amounts are spent on strategic communication. So how deep is your frustration at what is not yet being achieved?
Well, I mean, there's not much point in getting frustrated. I think we've just got to get better. And I think we're at a point where 9 years after the Paris Agreement, nearly a decade after the agreement, the one piece of the puzzle that has really fallen flat, I think, is governments' communication with their own people about what the enormity of the sort of climate challenge is, but not in a way to freeze people or terrify them, but in a way that sort of engages them in, making life better for everybody. So
What's
governments.
missing, do you think?
Well, honesty, which is, hard come by. At Blavatnik, we talk about the fact that you've got to remain ambitious because we've got a big transition to go through. You've got to keep it simple because you're government and you can only do so many things at once, and you've got to be able to communicate them. And then it's got to be durable, right? So you've got to be able to maintain the coalition that elected you in the first place. But that does require, I think, you come clean with people. And we've seen in this extraordinary year of elections, 2024, that most of the elections are not being fought with climate being anywhere near the sort of list of priorities that governments are thinking about, yet everything that they will do will be affected by climate. The ability to raise taxes, what we're going to prioritize that tax spend on, how you make your health service resilient to extreme heat, how do you find the jobs of the future? How do you have an affordable energy bill? That's all being predicated by climate change. So pretending like it isn't barreling towards us, I think doesn't serve us well. And you've got to hold the center together because on the extremes, the extreme left and the extreme right, these are protest places. These are places of discontent. And so then the climate agenda becomes an agenda of discontent. No, it has to be an agenda of hope and of equity and equality. And that's not Pollyanna. That is the challenge of the next few years.
Given the enormity of what the science is warning about, as I said right at the beginning, are we anywhere close to a mass movement for pressure because of the enormity, the existential threat, our survival as human beings on this planet?
So I think we see glimpses of it and then it sort of fades and then we see glimpses again. We've seen popular movements. We've from Fridays for the Future to Extinction Rebellion at one point to the mass mobilization of young people to vote to keep out the far right in some countries. So we see it. And I think what we haven't quite done is work out how in modern democracy to sustain that. So all of the evidence is that despite the pressure of sort of pocketbook, as they call it in the United States, or cost of living issues, the public is worried about climate change and wants to know what to do. And that's not falling off the list of priorities, that's staying high across the world. And so what we really need to do is sort of latch onto that and find innovations in democracy. How do you engage the public in a more thoughtful conversation than soundbite clickbait allows about, well, okay, so if we're going to have more renewable energy, then what are we going to do about NIMBYism? Where are you going to put the line that brings the offshore energy onshore? Where are we going to put the new onshore wind turbines? How are we going to pay for the installation of our homes? How can we help each other? I think that these are profound conversations which can't take place in clickbait, media-driven political dialogue. And so we've seen around the world experiments in citizens' assemblies, experiments in finding ways for communities to surface how they want to live with each other. And I think we're going to have to see much more of that underpinning then the parliamentary democracies that exist in the majority of the world.
Do you reckon, Rachel, that actually the corporate sector, the political sector, is sufficiently with it now to understand where the public is? I say that because what we're seeing already is a dilution of corporate commitments, a pushing back of timelines, a dilution of ambition, and we've even got companies now refusing to go ahead with investments in things like biofuels. A big announcement by Shell that they don't want to go ahead with biofuels because there's not enough profit in it. In other words, there's not enough profit in green.
So the whole enterprise of shifting through transitions to a world where we're living more safely on this planet, it requires this extraordinary partnership between public and private sector. So each have to do their job, and both are kind of falling down at the moment. But they have to do their job in order to help the other partner do the job. So what do we need from government? We need direction of travel. Well, we have that. We know we've got to get close to net zero as soon as possible. We know we can't leave people behind in that journey. And then we've got to put meat on the bones of exactly how that transition is going to be managed and how the private sector should behave within that transition, how it will get rewarded and how it will get penalized if it doesn't. The private sector then understands very well the science, understands very well that this is a direction of travel, but is failing, I think, to engage with government in a dialogue of like, if you do this, we can do that. And if given that the private sector, especially sort of heavy duty emissions heavy sectors, what we used to call hard to abate, but now they're all on a journey. These companies have to engage in a positive lobbying of government for the conditions that they need in order to be able to invest earlier, because there is a time cost of carbon. If we invest in the 2040s, it's not as helpful as if we invest now. And I think that we see the private sector lobbying very, very hard against the things it doesn't want, in particular the fossil fuel industry. But we haven't, except in glimpses, seen the private sector mobilize for the kinds of tax reforms, regulatory reforms, long-term investment decision-making that it needs in order to invest now. And so I hope that we can get to a point of a more permanent state of, more mature engagement.
How much do you fear, though, that it's increasingly fashionable to back shareholders' interests, which is maximizing profits? And what you're seeing is a kind of rowing back on the commitments to green in order to make sure, not just fossil fuels, that actually the profits are there for the shareholders, because they say actually green isn't producing the kind of profits that we expected.
Well, under the current system of how we regulate business, how we regulate the financial sector, it's not obtuse for companies to decide to sit on that investment and pay a dividend or invest it back into the business in a different way. I mean, I think that we have to change the rules for how we expect companies to behave in the transition. And then once the rules are set, then companies will compete on who's the best working within those parameters. So at the moment, we're kind of asking companies to voluntarily invest earlier in in their transitions where the regulatory framework is not there. And of course, companies are looking at this rhetoric coming from the far right, disagreements in the center and on the left on how we're going to manage the transition. And they're looking at what they perceive to be regulatory uncertainty. And so in that atmosphere, in the boardroom and in the C-suite, people are sitting on the investment and not investing early enough. And I think we'd like to see much more corporate leadership. But to be fair, corporate, we have to set the rules of the race clearer so that more corporates will do this. And of course, we focus on the few thousand companies who are the leaders in each sector of the economy. There are millions of companies, especially in emerging markets and in larger growing economies that have no rules, no parameters, no guidelines in place for how they should be investing for the future. So again, we especially in the West, we make a fetish of sort of setting people up for success and then smacking them when they're not perfect. We've got to be able to put regulation in place that brings everybody along.
Let me pick you up on something you said at the London Climate Innovation Forum. You said we now have to reset. We're losing fans of green. A lot of people don't even talk about it. In other words, even for someone like you, there seemed to be a kind of fatalism that actually the ambition and the possibility of achieving it was beginning to recede long into the distance. And it needs a real remotivation to get stuff going, including on communication.
Yeah, I think I was reacting to analysis of many of the election results around the world and some of the polling pre-elections in other parts of the world, and looking at the fact that in many countries, the idea of green has been considered to be elite. People are worried about their energy bills. They're worried about where the jobs are going to come from. They're worried about whether or not their kids are going to be better off than they are, which has been sort of the phenomenon upon which Western liberalism has been built for the last 80 years. They're worried about these day-to-day issues. And I think that much of the climate debate has become divorced from those really tangible day-to-day issues. And so there is a responsibility to make it clear that, by helping you insulate your house, you will be better off, you will be safer, you'll be warmer, you will do better, and it's good for the environment. And I think that there has been a failure in some jurisdictions, in some parts of the world, and in some parts of the movement to really grapple with how we bring everybody along. And so if you're 16 and you're voting in Berlin and you switch your vote, or you decide not to vote Green, but to vote for the AfD, or if you're protesting in the streets of Nairobi because you don't want to see tax rises because you think that's going to hurt you, and I could go on around and around the world, those young people have to be convinced that being green is something that's going to provide them with a future. And that's really where the battle is now for everybody who's elected into office this year. Is this cannot be, we cannot allow green to be a wedge issue.
Well, we've got 3 minutes left, Rachel. Let me get a big idea from you then about how this can be turned around, how communication can take place, how billions of people around the world can really understand the enormity of what they need to do and what they expect governments to do as well. In other words, mobilization through communication.
So for government leaders, I think there's a tendency to freeze, right? This is a very complicated agenda. Climate is everything. Everything is climate. How do I organize myself? What do I do in which order? Which are the most important policy instruments that will get me the biggest purchase. And I think that the policy community, the world that is supposed to be helping, needs to focus on helping government take one step and then another step and another step. There's been a lot of focus for the last decade on mobilizing private finance, and all of those things have to happen. But government has to govern. In no country in the world is local government doing well financially. In no country in the world are cities well financed. How are we going to build resilience and adaptation without them? So let's maintain ambition, because the last thing we can do is become less ambitious. And then how do we keep it simple? So how do you as a government set out to do three things and do them well? And how do you engage the private sector and make young people excited about that? And then how does that continue in a conversation with people, a more honest conversation, to allow that to be a durable coalition for action? So I think there's room for the climate movement to come and sort of be a little bit more humble in support of ordinary people to organize, innovations in democracy, and then leaders who are prepared to sort of engage with the public in a different way. Meanwhile, corporate leaders need to be spending their government affairs budget on really asking government for what they need, rather than sitting on the sidelines, spending their corporate advocacy budgets on the things that, are still part of the fossil fuel economy. So there is a private sector leadership moment here as well. But really, we need to put the focus back on governing and governments in order to help us through this transition.
With this, Rachel, can there be public power, mass public power? Is that where we need to head in order to achieve the momentum and the mass and the scale that really is needed, given the science we're facing at the moment?
Yes, and I think that actually, and you see this in the UK, you see it in the US, you see it across most Western democracies, but you also see it in other countries as well. People are concerned about the future. They're concerned about extreme heat. They're concerned about having to move off the land there and migrating. They're concerned about the impacts of climate change. And I think it's generational. Grandparents are worried about their grandkids. Young people are worried about the future. I think it cuts across class as well. I think it cuts across rural and urban. And it will take sophisticated civil society, sophisticated governance and governments to be able to tap into that. We've seen the far right and the far left at times try to drive a wedge, but that wedge doesn't work for very long. And we see the resilience of what is a broader coalition of people who want life to be safer. And I think that's something that governments and government politicians should have the courage to tap into.
Quickly, if you can, given what you're studying and given what you're working on, can that be done? Can that really be achieved, given what the science is telling us and warning us about?
Yeah, I think it can. I think it can be done. I think we've seen examples of the public being engaged in really complicated conversations. For example, constitutional conversations in Ireland, other attempts at citizens' alliances. I think we've also seen that, telling the scientists to communicate more or better isn't the issue. The science is very clear. It's what does the policy environment, what does government do with that scientific advice? And I think we can see that in some countries, being able to build a receptacle for that science actually helps then with investment decisions. So yes, this is all about how to organize yourself in government, whether at the national level or the local level, and eventually at the international level as well, which we haven't talked about. But yes, this can be done.
Well, Rachel, thanks so much. You can reference every detail that Rachel has given us. A transcript of the podcast is posted in parallel on our website, along with contact details for us and for Rachel Kyte. Do please join us when we next have a conversation about thinking the unthinkable. From me, Nick Gowing, until next time, keep thinking unthinkable. More than ever, it's both possible and necessary, and the urgency is there, as we've just heard from Rachel. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.